رضي الله تعالى عنهم من كافة المؤمنين. نعم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Alhamdulillah. Let's try that again. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Thank you. Ahsant. MashaAllah. Alhamdulillah. So, Alhamdulillah, I was invited to do a part 2 from last night's discussion. So, I wanted to also offer enough time for us to have a discussion as well, but also to build upon what we talked about yesterday. So, as I mentioned yesterday, as I started off yesterday, defining history, that history is the subject matter of remembering what everybody tends to forget. And in this case, in the history of Islam in America, and particularly the contribution of Black Americans to the history of Islam in America, history is defined as remembering what people never knew about in the first place. So here is something that is quite interesting. The African American community in the 60s, Muslim community in the 60s, and in the 70s and in the 80s and in the 90s, as a community, right, not as individuals one by one necessarily, but as a community, rooted Islam in this country, right? Rooted, founded Islam in this country. Now, understand what I'm talking about. I didn't say bring Islam, I said rooted it. There were 3 impacts of what we talked about yesterday, 3 different impacts of entire communities across the East Coast and the West Coast and major cities like Chicago, Detroit, Dallas, Houston, etc. in the middle. There were 3 impacts of this communal conversion. Dr. Sherman Jackson likes to call this phenomenon a communal conversion. In other words, the conversion of an entire community to Islam. Not necessarily that every single African American became Muslim, but every single African American became literate in Islam in the broad sense, so that as a community, Islam in this country found its most fertile soil in the African American community. I understand that that was a historical fact. So the African American community, on account of so many issues of being, a class, a racial category of people in this country that were struggling for rights, Islam found a home and found fertile soil in the community, and the community as a whole embraced it as a community and as an alternative to Christianity. Now, that does not mean there were no Black Christians, of course there were. But many of them as a community, there was an embrace of that, and particularly and specifically, there was a communal embrace of Islam in the urban northern areas of the United States, right? The urban northern areas, and northern meaning northwest and northeastern parts, but the urban phenomenon. In terms of the south of the U.S. and in the rural areas of the U.S., then Christianity found a more comfortable, fertile area there. So you find that the Christian churches were there. However, in the 80s, in the 1980s, you had migration, Muslim communities, entire communities, migrating from the north to the south. And therefore in the 80s and the 90s, up until 9/11, you had a large, massive growth of African American Muslim communities that spread and spread because of the profound da'wah work and because of prison work, prison da'wah that was there as well. So there was an intent to target the African American Muslim community. Imam Malcolm, rahimahullah, said that he always thought that the most fertile grounds for mass conversions in the United States were the African American community. So that was in that time period. Now, what happened as a result? As a result of this mass, as Dr. Jackson calls it, communal conversion, particularly in the North, particularly in the urban areas, places like DC, places like Maryland, places like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, Boston, etc., right? Jersey, Brooklyn, Harlem. Particularly these areas, what happened as a result? Well, as a result of that, Islam, there was a change in the perception of Islam from being a place, there was a change in Islam from being perceived as a religion that was exported into the United States to being understood as an indigenous American phenomenon. This is really important, brothers and sisters. So as a result of this communal conversion, on the basis that a large segment of the American population in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, we're talking, hundreds of thousands of people across major geographies impacted by Islam in the arts, in the prisons, and in various communities and pop culture. Because of this communal conversion, that was the cause of founding and rooting Islam in an indigenous American experience, right? So this is where the idea of Islam as an American religion becomes developed and supported, right? That there's an entire embrace of it, and this embrace, this communal embrace, is an embrace of Islam, and here's the other important point, that is separate and distinct from cultural practices. So you don't have a communal conversion to Islam as represented by a particular country, right? So you don't have a communal conversion according to Malaysian Islam, or you don't have a communal conversion according to Sudanese Islam, or you don't have a communal conversion according to Turkish Islam, or you don't have a communal conversion according to Pakistani Islam. You don't have a communal conversion according to Saudi Islam or Egyptian Islam, right? Or Moroccan Islam. It's just Islam. It is absent and separate from any cultural coloring. It's just Islam. And therefore, in the African American community, it was all about Islam in this country and what can we do to define American Islam in our terms, right? In our terms meaning in American terms. And there was not a fear, there was a reaction against the imposition of other cultural practices in the community, particularly because there was the idea that, well, the American condition requires understanding the history of this country, requires understanding the context, and the representation of Islam in different places looks different, right? So the way Islam is presented in one country is different from the way it's presented in another country because of cultural practices. So in the African American community, you didn't have this discussion about culture. You didn't have this debate about what people were gonna, what norms were gonna happen in terms of how people married and how people divorced and how people set up masjids and how imams led salats or how communities were brought together, and you didn't have that. It was just about, what did the Prophet do? Right? That was what mattered. What did the Prophet do, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And there was a clear mandate universally amongst African American Muslims in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and up to definitely in the 2000s, and still today, that, you know, if the Prophet says it, that's it. There is that's it. And people believe that, right? I mean, that's whatever the Prophet said, that's it, right? That might, you know, this might look someplace, this might look different in a different location, but if that's what the Prophet said, so be it. So that was an impact. The impact of this phenomenon was that Islam became Americanized based on this communal conversion, and it developed its own American identity as a result. And that American identity was the merger of the perception of, you know, Muslims and people of color, or black people, right? From all kinds of perceptions, but from all kinds of walks of life. And in the American context, particularly in urban areas, in the inner city, there was a marriage that occurred between Islam and the struggle of African American people for civil rights in this country and for recognition and to sort of fight back against oppressive conditions. So what we call, or what I call in my work, the idea that Islam in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s developed, in America, developed a certain feel to it, a certain approach to it, a certain characteristic that was totally different from anywhere else in the world because of the American conditions. And because of specifically the American conditions in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, in relationship as it relates to America's challenge in accepting and giving equal rights to people of color in this country of all walks of life. So Islam in this country developed what was called a protest disposition, right? A reaction or a coloring or a shading of protest. The idea that to be Muslim in this country meant that you could not just be a person that prayed 5 times a day in your home, in your area, and that was good enough. Absolutely no, that didn't work. That to be Muslim in this country meant that the plight and the situation and the condition of people that are oppressed globally mattered. So the plight of the poor here mattered, and the plight of the poor anywhere else in the world mattered. The plight of those that are oppressed here mattered, and the condition of those oppressed globally mattered. So this came from Malcolm X. This came from his teaching that we needed to, in his words, restore. He called it restoration. We needed to restore our connection as Muslims to each other. And restoration, in the words of Malcolm, what he meant by, rahimahullah, by restoration was that Muslims needed to be concerned about the well-being of other Muslims globally. That I, as an American Muslim, cannot be free if my brothers and sisters in different parts of America are not free, and my brothers and sisters in different parts of the Muslim world are not free. So the idea of protest against all forms of condition and never, ever, ever being satisfied with or being complacent with any success that we have here. Because how can we as Muslims be satisfied with our own success in a particular city when our brothers and sisters are still struggling to secure basic living conditions and basic rights globally? So in the United States, specifically in the Black American community, for almost 50 years, what it meant to be Muslim was to take your understanding of Islam and to practice it in a way that signified that you were dissatisfied with just token gifts thrown out to certain members of the community to show that this person is successful, so the whole community is successful. Or this project got built, so the whole community is stable as a result of that. Or rights were given to this group of people, so all the Muslims should be happy, and this is success. If there was one person that was left behind, everybody was left behind. So the idea of Islam as a protest religion, Islam in America took on that coloring, that shade, those clothings, that garb. That's unique. It doesn't happen. It has not happened anywhere else in the Muslim world. There's no other place where your Islam is intrinsically tied to how well your community is doing around you. So if you've got hunger, if you've got people in your neighborhood that are hungry, people in your neighborhood that don't have access to health care, people in your neighborhood that are on the streets, you got drugs in your neighborhood, you don't know Islam. And you haven't practiced Islam. It doesn't matter how many times you pray. It doesn't matter how many days you fasted Ramadan. It doesn't matter how many times you've gone to Hajj. Benefiting yourself is not Islam. In the African American Muslim community, that was the history of the entire community. And this was taken from the words of the Prophet ﷺ, which was later taught in so many communities across the Northeast, and then it went down to the South, that the Muslim community is sort of marked and branded by the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that says, "Man lam yahtam bi umur al-muslimin falaysa minhum." Whoever is not concerned about the affairs of the Muslims is not one of them. So if you know that something's going on in your community, you cannot have a masjid or a community center or a business and think that you are successful just because you have financial profit when you see something going on in your community that's affecting it. So as a result of that, every single mosque in the African American community in this 40-year period had certain staff, volunteers whose job, men and women, whose job it was to go out and patrol at night to make sure there were no drugs in the neighborhood. And entire neighborhoods were cleaned up. The success of Imam Siraj Wahaj in Brooklyn is just one of so many examples. So many examples. You had to make sure there was no domestic violence in your community. You had to make sure that there were no drugs in your community. You had to make sure there were no alcohol stores, no liquor stores in your community. You could not, in the black neighborhoods, have an alcohol store, a liquor store. You could not. You could not. So the Muslims had a certain reputation in terms of cleaning up the neighborhood. In New York City, in Brooklyn, there was a clear understanding that the New York City police, the NYPD, did not have to patrol certain neighborhoods where black American Sunni Muslims were in charge. They didn't go there. Matter of fact, there was, now this is an actual historical fact I'm about to tell you. Non-Muslims in neighborhoods in Brooklyn, in Atlanta, Georgia, and in other parts of the community, non-Muslims would contribute a certain amount of money monthly to the masjid in exchange for security of their homes and their neighborhoods and their children's schools. And the Muslims, the masjid, the Muslims called this money they would receive, you ready for this? They called it jizya. I'm serious, this is a fact here. They called it jizya. So they would meet with community members. You have community meetings in the neighborhood. The people knew the Muslims could protect them. So they would make arrangements. They would pay jizya to the masjid. So masjids were funded not just by Muslims. Right? In the inner city black American neighborhoods in the Northeast for 40 years. Not just by Muslims. Non-Muslims invested in masajid because they knew that investing in mosques meant the safety of the neighborhood. In Atlanta, Georgia, where I was born and raised in my community, it was a known fact that if somebody ever broke into your house, or if a man ever put his hands on his wife, Muslim or not, if you were in the neighborhood, and we had blocks and blocks and blocks, nobody called the police. There was no such thing in the black neighborhood as calling 911, except for if you had to go to the hospital. But for safety and protection, you never called 911, you called the masjid. The masjid would send a squad over to your house. Tons of cases. Brother put his hands on his wife, the squad would come over at night in a van, escort the husband out, or escort the guy out. If he came back in the home, he never put his hands on that woman again. If there was a break-in, within a few weeks or so, the person would be caught. The person would be dealt with. And that would not happen again. Jizya would be paid by that family. That house, that neighborhood would be patrolled. The police knew about it. In the city of Atlanta, the police didn't like that. They felt that this sort of vigilante, thing was not good enough. In Brooklyn, in many precincts, there was excellent relationships. They understood that this was community policing. It helped their officers out. They didn't have to patrol those areas. The neighborhoods were cleaned up. There are newspaper articles in the New York Times, front page articles about neighborhoods that were cleaned up by the Muslims. This stuff is in the New York Times in the 70s, in the 80s. The archives are there. Front page, Muslims clean up the neighborhood. No more drugs in the street in Brooklyn. Relationships between police officers, prostitution taken care of. We didn't have drug problems in our neighborhoods after the Muslims moved in. Protest religion. You had to make sure your communities were safe. Well, that's what the Prophet did. He went into Medina, and Medina was safe. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Why would we sit here and think because we have a building or an institution that we're safe, and right outside we've got corruption, we've got oppression, we've got drunkenness, we've got lewdness, we've got crime, people are hungry. This is what it means. And this is why Islam in this country, in that time period, was not looked at as a foreign import in the Northeast and in the urban areas. It was looked at as an American phenomenon, particularly in the Black American neighborhoods. Now, that changed in the 9/11 era. That changed. So this is the second thing. The first is that there was a shift in the idea of Islam and the understanding of the perception. The perception of Islam is coming from over there, wherever there was. That no, it became rooted here because of communal conversions. Entire communities literally bought into Islam, whether it was they converted or they paid jizya or they started giving their children. That's how they started giving their children's names of Ali and Akbar, etc. That's why, because they lived with Muslims and those names had value because somebody named Ali patrolled the house, right? Or somebody named Khadija checked up on them and brought them food. Right? That's how so they would name their daughter, even though if they were not Muslim, they would name their daughter Khadija. So the entire community in the north urban areas was like that, and then that migrated down south into the 80s and the 90s. And Islam grew, and with it, the idea of a protest disposition grew, that you had to struggle to make your environment safe, and you started with yourself, then you started with your community, and it never stopped as long as there was somebody overseas that was oppressed. It never stopped. And so the motto was, the struggle continues, right? The struggle continues. So if you heard about something in the news about something going on, you might be safe, you might have your job, but you would read about that and you say, you sit next to your Muslim brother and sister, you say the struggle continues. So we grew up as kids with the notion that you always had to struggle. There was no sense of complacency. There was no sense of arrival. There was no sense of, success in its finality. It was always a struggle. And that was considered part of the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, always a struggle. The Prophet ﷺ never sat back, chilled, relaxed, da'iman, struggle. So that was just part of, and the motto, as I mentioned yesterday, was, victory or moat. Victory, like success here or success there. But either way, we're good to go, So this was the history of this area, of Islam in this time. And people don't know this stuff, right? If we knew this stuff, we would have a totally different perspective on establishing Islam here. So now the efforts about fighting Islamophobia and the idea of Islam being, imported here, that's something that came as a result of the propaganda in the 9/11, in the post 9/11 world. People forgot about what was going on in the United States in terms of the growth and development of Islam here. You had, before 9/11, you had multiple cities in the United States, in the Northeast and in the South, that had elected African American Muslim mayors. You had multiple cities in the United States that had elected African American Muslim judges. You had multiple cities in the United States that had elected African American Muslim members of state congresses, state houses, state office. So you had elected officials that were Muslim that operated in the judiciary, that were in the state office, state government, local municipal government, African American Muslims involved on city councils and on school districts. Nobody said anything. Nobody had a problem with anything. It didn't matter if your name was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and you had the highest scoring averages in the NBA, or your name was Muhammad Ali. Didn't matter what your name was. There was no making fun of names. There was no negativity. It was part and parcel of being an American. But it was just a phenomenon that people saw as part of the Black American experience, that they didn't choose Christianity, they chose Islam because Islam offered them something different from what Christianity did. That was just who they are. That was it. Musical, look at rap artists, Queen Latifah, she's not Muslim, right? She wasn't Muslim. So many other rap artists with Muslim names, etc. So this started to occur. Then in the 9/11 happened. And there was an entire agenda, well-funded, funded through certain machinery, that contributed to the deconstruction of that image and sought to break it down and sought to demonize Islam, and particularly the Americanization of Islam. And in order to disrupt the Americanization of Islam, the perception had to be that Islam is not indigenous to the American experience. It started in this country with 9/11. That became the narrative. That Islam started here like this. It started with different terrorist attacks in different buildings in the 90s. It started over there. And all these images were of war and US soldiers being in conflict situations, and war and terror films started coming out. There was this bombardment of images in the American psyche and in the public about Islam as this sort of foreign agenda. And the Muslim community responded to that in the wrong way, in reaction, not action. Right? So we responded completely differently. So this was a different shift. And the legacy of what happened in terms of the work that was going to develop communities and everything, all of that fell to the wayside for a variety of reasons. So I think in lieu of time, we'll sort of stop there, and maybe we'll take some engagement, some Q&A, and some discussion, inshallah ta'ala. But the last thing I want to say is that this what has happened in this country, Islam started in this country as an American phenomenon in the 60s. There were Muslims here before that. There were Muslims here way back even before Christopher Columbus. There have been Muslims here, the Muslim slaves that were here, but there was no community of Muslims here. That's the difference. There was always an understanding that the Muslims that were here, that were enslaved peoples and indigenous and descendants of enslaved peoples, were concerned with going back home. They were isolated individuals. And after that, Islam becomes distorted in many ways. But it starts to develop as an American phenomenon in the 60s, and it takes on its full shade of an American culture, if you will, to Islam as a protest religion, an activist religion, a social justice religion, an advocacy religion throughout that period as well. And because of that, there was not a problem, because nobody could criticize the Muslims. Nobody could. Nobody could criticize the Muslims because they saw neighborhoods being cleaned up. Whatever you wanted to say, you couldn't say. They knew Muslims that made their lives better. I grew up with people who who when they heard the term halal meat, I grew up with non-Muslims, who when they heard the term halal meat, to them it meant a full stomach. Do you understand what I'm saying? To them it meant a full stomach because they were fed halal meat. They were fed, the Muslims fed them weekly, right? So halal meat, it enabled them to get off of food stamps, for example. Halal was not an economic brand. It was not a certain meat that you have to buy from a store. It was your livelihood. It meant your full stomach. There were parks there were arrangements made in the city, in local cities. I'm talking about major cities. In the 80s, in the 90s, think about this. There were arrangements made by the Muslim communities with local cities for public parks during Eid, public parks paid for by US taxpayers, to have a section for animals to be slaughtered and meat distributed on Eid by the Muslims. Now you tell me where that can happen today. I know, I was there. Public parks. Chickens, lamb, the meat went to everybody in the neighborhood, Muslim and not. Non-Muslims knew Eid, loved it. It was their festival too. The city supported it. Why? Because the community would vote for those city officials. And they said, you better not touch the Muslims. You better not do anything to the Muslims. They're our livelihood. Right? We have lost this. We don't get it back through legislation. Not like that. You can't legislate love. You can't legislate respect. You can't legislate away hate. You've got to live and practice and impact people's lives. Then they love you, then they respect you, then they know you, and they want to be like you. So that's what this history was pre-9/11, and that happened in the Black American Sunni Muslim community here. Those are facts. So this history is really important for our youth to understand what it means to be Muslim in this country, that it means that for our purposes here, for Islam in America, we do not, that we distinguish between cultural Islam and Islam. Number one, there's a distinction between cultural Islam, what I call Islam, and Islam. Well, the Prophet says do something, and then there may be cultural norms that say do something like this. That has to be differentiated. That has to be separated, right? So this is the first thing that has to be revived here. That got lost in the post-9/11. That got lost. So there has to be a clear understanding of what is culture and what is Islam. Then the second phenomenon, that's the way it is here. That's the way American Islam works. Otherwise, it's not American Islam. It's just, for example, Egyptian Islam in America, or it's Pakistani Islam in America, or it's Turkish Islam in America. And it'll always be viewed as a foreign import. And it will always be problematic in terms of acceptance from a wider audience. But when you distinguish between culture and the text itself, the religion itself, then you can explain concepts to people that make sense universally, regardless of what condition they're in. And the second phenomenon is that it's taught as that part of faith, part of being a believer, is being concerned about people you don't know. Right? So if you want to connect with Allah Ta'ala, you cannot remain disconnected with His servants, with His creatures. You have to be connected to them. And you have to see that your rising up and your elevation, your enhancement, your growth and development occurs with a unit, a group of people. You know, so that's the way that's what comes out of. That's what is derived from this history. That's what you get when you archive, when you excavate this history. That's what comes to the surface. This is not for me. This is what comes to the surface. This is the core. This is the essence of what's being taught. before Malcolm X died, he was offered scholarships for study at by a certain institution. I won't name it. And the condition to the scholarship was, we'll teach your people, but when they go back, they've got to teach Islam this way. Malcolm said, thank you, but no thank you. We'll do Islam our way here. We need information on the text. That's what we need. But don't tell us how to apply the text. This context, we're the experts in the context. If you want to teach the text, ahlan wa sahlan. But don't teach your context, because it's not applicable here. We have a unique context here. And we are the ones that understand it best, he said. So they never gave this, this particular institution never gave it to him. You know. So with that in mind, let's open up now for some questions, inshallah ta'ala, if anyone has any questions or anything like that. Yes, here to my left. Yeah, bismillah. Wa alaikum salam.
I had some time to go back and take over what we spoke about last night.
Yes. Good to see you again. Better, yes.
I had some time to go back and ponder over how Islam reached some of the descendants of slaves through music.
Yeah.
And the example was when the time of Farrakhan and poetry in the Arabic language was very important in society.
Correct. Correct.
You had a distinct position in society.
Right. Right.
And when the Quran was revealed, the poets in the Arabic were very poetry that heard it's not from man.
Right.
So it caused that idol, it caused him to change the way he thought and acted. I don't need to bury my child.
Right.
I don't need to mistreat him. I need to
Right.
be responsible for my neighbor. So it impacted the way I thought and the way he acted. And when Islam was introduced into our music, for our, like myself, it made me think, well, what is this that they're talking about? What is this Allah? What is this Islam?
Right.
And what is it causes us to think different. We don't have to shoot at each other in the neighborhood. We don't need to poison our neighborhood because we can be better to each other.
Right.
So it's not really a question, but I just want people to know that some of us weren't given Islam through da'wah or
Right.
people stand on the corner. It came to us through the music.
Right.
And then from that point, we went out and learned what is Islam.
Beautifully said. I mean, a large segment of the youth in the African American urban communities came to Islam through music because it was hip hop that animated certain things that made youth be like, what does that mean? And what does this mean? What is Mecca? What is Medina? What is, on the album cover of a couple hip hop artists, they had, Allahu Akbar in English. What is Allahu Akbar, right? So you're right. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ had a favorite poet, right? Who was the favorite poet of the Prophet ﷺ? Hassan bin Thabit, radiyallahu ta'ala. While the Quran uses language to change human conditions, right? And not only language, but rhyming language. Not only rhyming language, but rhythmic rhyming language, in the sense that Quran is a recitation. By the way, it's a recitation. Right? You do qira'ah. You can't say, for example, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Malik in your salat. You can't do that, even in front of public. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah. No. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. There's a melody there. There's a sound, wakes people up, gets people interested. There's sound, there's rhythm, then there's words, then there's meaning. All of that is packaged beautifully. Prophet Dawood alayhi salam, his entire book was recited. And the Quran is called, the meaning of the word Quran in English is a recital, right? We use the word recital for musical performances. So there were so many connections like this that were made so that to help certain people in certain conditions who are attracted to different things, to help bridge them to Islam. And that was a reality for many in the community. and then they devoted themselves to continuing to propagate the message of Islam in their neighborhoods, in their contexts, and through their art. So that's real, yeah. Yes, assalamu alaikum.
I have a couple questions, it's okay?
Yes, please.
Yeah. First question was the scholarship you was talking about, the Malcolm X, I guess. Which country was that they didn't want it?
Which what now?
Remember you said Malcolm X, some non-profit organization, they wanted a scholarship?
No, it was a country.
Yeah, country.
It was a school, yeah.
Yeah, which country was that? I was just wondering.
I'd rather not say publicly. No comment.
Oh, that's important. And the second thing, you said Islam is different in different ways, in different countries.
Yeah.
I don't feel that way because, I've been living in America almost 23 years and I met so many different Muslims. We all same, but American Muslims are different than we live because they focus on more like color. I mean, I grew up in a village in my country. We had every color. We did not care until I came to this country.
Yeah, this is a very racial country,
I
right?
did not know about racism because my husband was black. It was, I had so many problems with my, about my children, myself. I got insulted. They never accepted me actually. 23 years is a long time, but, we suffered, like me and my kids. In Turkey, we don't have this, like racism. People talk about, they spend so much time about racism in this country. Black ones, white ones, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Even the Muslim one you talk with the National Islam, I don't know which one you was talking. Remember you said they cleaned the neighborhood and stuff?
Yeah. They weren't the
Who
nation.
is that, the National Islam?
No. This is way after the nation.
I went there Million March, thing in the Washington D.C. It was so many people was all over from America, and most of them was black. And then he was racist too. He was talking like Islam, like just for black people, but it's not. It's for everyone.
Right.
Actually, for all women.
Right. So you're dealing with a couple things, and let me sort of untangle these things for you. So firstly, there are different cultures and there's different applications and practices of Islam all over the world. The way Islam is practiced in Yemen is not the way it's practiced in Turkey. It is not. The way Islam is practiced in Pakistan is not the way it's practiced in Malaysia. The way it's practiced in Malaysia is not the way it's practiced in Saudi Arabia. The way it's practiced in Saudi is not the way it's practiced in Morocco. The way it's practiced in Morocco is not the way it's practiced in Egypt, even though they're on the same continent. So Islam does look different totally. When I was in Damascus, Syria, I had one version of Islam taught to me. I was exposed to one cultural practice of Islam, one understanding of Islam, one approach to Islam. When I lived in Yemen, completely different. You were required in Yemen to cover your face. It was required. You didn't have a choice. And that was taught religiously. In Damascus, it was not like that. Even though they read from the same textbook in Islamic law, the same book, but the interpretations were different. The same book, I know, I read it. Then I went to Istanbul. I went to Egypt. The way Islam is presented in Istanbul, totally different than Yemen. Istanbul and Yemen is not the same. Muslims, yes, but the practice, cultural practice, presentation of Islam, night and day. And both are beautiful places. So there are vast differences. And believe me, Muslims in the United States that come from different places, different backgrounds, even Muslims who are born and raised in this country and come from different geographical regions, very different. There is racism in the Muslim world. there's racism everywhere. Turkey has racist issues too. Every single Muslim country does. You just don't hear about those things unless you talk to someone who's experienced it. So if you and I sit down and have a conversation, I could tell you stories. You experience those things, and just like it has racism issues, they have gender issues all over the Muslim world. Women have issues as well. Foreigners have issues. Every country has its thing. Now, you're right in the sense of the United States of America being a more racialized country than parts of the Muslim world, without a doubt, 100%, because of the history of this country. So you're right that that it is more racialized here, but you still have problems of race. I mean, just look at the Prophet's time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In the Prophet's time, one companion of his, Abu Dhar, called another companion of his, Bilal, son of a black woman. That's a hadith. He called Abu Dhar, radiyallahu ta'ala an, called Bilal, you son of a black woman. That's a Sahaba in Medina, both of them. The Prophet ﷺ was shocked. He said, Ya Abu Dhar. He said, oh Abu Dhar. He said, did you say that he was the son of a black woman? And Abu Dhar looked at the Prophet ﷺ. This is Medina. Why? Because our mothers who? Hajar alayhi salam, who was Egyptian. Right? She was African, she was Egyptian. At that point, Abu Dhar began to cry. He dropped to his knees, this is like the hadith, he dropped to his knees and kissed the feet of Bilal. Bilal moved back, radiyallahu ta'ala. Oh, he kissed his feet, and he wanted to do it again. Bilal moved back and pulled him up. And he said, oh, Abu Dhar, he said, I forgave you before you even wanted to say I'm sorry. Even in this time, the Prophet ﷺ was dealing with racism amongst his own community. Racism exists as a human condition. It exists in Muslims, and the biggest problem we have as a Muslim community is we think we're not racist. We have to get over that. Everybody's got prejudices, believe me. And we have to acknowledge these biases. And this has been the main issue that has prevented our communities in this country from working together. Why do you think we don't know this history that I'm talking about here? Because we don't talk to each other. We don't do business together. We don't marry each other. Everybody marries everybody else in their own culture, in their own community, from their own background and everything. You try to let different people, I mean, people fall out when they see me and my wife walk down the street. She's Egyptian American, I'm African American. I can't tell you how many times women come to my wife, guys come to me, how'd that happen? Why did you marry him? Is the question. I never get the question, why did you marry her? Never. People learn I can speak Arabic, I'm trained, all of a sudden I have value. What if I didn't speak Arabic? What if I wasn't trained? What if I didn't have, and she knew me before that. We married each other before that. What if I didn't have the things that you have to tell people in order to convince them? Would I not have value, for example? So we do this in communities until we intermarry, until we do business together, until we do cooperative together, until we live together, we will always be separate and superficially together. And the fact that we can't get to that point still means we have some fear of each other, on both sides, or problem with each other. So yeah, we still have problems, and we have to overcome these things in our communities, inshallah. Yes, sister. Oh, and the last thing for the Million Man March, Farrakhan is not a Sunni Muslim at all. As a matter of fact, he's pledged allegiance to Jesus Christ. Farrakhan has. I've met him personally. And we've asked him, you know the truth. Why haven't you told the truth to your people? Why haven't you, accepted Sunni Islam? You know the truth. Tell your people. Do you know what his response was to me and the brothers that were with me? He said, in good time, I'll tell them the truth. That was his response. No, some people play games with Islam. Farrakhan is one of them. Yes. Wa alaikum salam.
You mentioned that the transition in the American Islam community happened at 9/11. Can you talk
sources?
Yeah, so there was, good question. There was funding that was coming in from overseas that was directly connected to the propagation of a particular ideology and a particular practice of Islam. And the idea was that this money was being sent to different organizations. It was sent to different organizations in the Black American Muslim community. It was rejected because the answer was, if you want to serve Islam, fine. We're not going to put an ideology on this. We're not going to put any kind of ideology of any particular approach to the practice of Islam. So the money was pulled, was not offered again. So it went to other places. And when you import foreign money with foreign agendas and foreign understandings and applications about Islam, so sometimes those foreign agendas are at odds with efforts to develop Islam domestically in a certain way, right? So if I have a lot of money and I go to your business or your organization and you're starting up your school or whatever, and I say, I'm going to pump money into your institution, but on the condition that you teach Islam this way, and this is the way we do it where I am. And this is the condition of the money. If you want the money, you take it. Some organizations took it, and they started to propagate this particular approach to Islam, which was at odds with establishing sort of homegrown communal institutions here. So it would be like me pumping money into an organization and saying, you have to teach once a month that the American government is the enemy of Islam. And you have to teach once a month, that Muslims should not run for public office because no Muslim should be serving, a non-Muslim government. No Muslim should be talking about sitting and legislating in a non-Muslim government. And you have to teach your people that they should not go to, the schools of the kuffar, right? Or the non-Muslim schools, that this is part of the conditions of the money. So if you're an organization in a city that's taking money with these kinds of conditions, and you've got another community that is teaching its community members to run for public office, to invest in the public school system, to vote, to be upstanding citizens, so you have two different communities that have two completely different perceptions about the growth and the development of Islam in this country. And that is what happened in the 90s. That's what happened in the 90s. And because of that, and part of the money, part of the conditions of the money that for those groups that took it was that you don't work in interfaith organizations, you don't work with interfaith, you don't have dialogue, interfaith dialogue. You do da'wah to somebody else, they've got to convert. But the idea of interfaith dialogue and establishing alliances between churches and synagogues and mosques so that as a community of faith, you work together to enhance your community. There were several institutions that took money on the condition that that was bid'ah, that was haram, that was kufr, that was selling out your religion. And then you had African American communities that were highly invested in that. So you had, for example, the Imam W.D. Muhammad community that had an initiative that their goal was to get rid of all of the images of Isa, alayhi salam, Jesus, in churches, right? So they had an initiative where nationally they were going to establish a dialogue with churches about the idea and the problem of trying to draw God, that this was wrong. So their entire platform in dealing with churches was based on the idea that we want to get you to stop showing pictures of God, or of trying to depict him and showing our prophet like this. Don't do that. And so what they started to do was start dialogue in churches in the South and in many parts of the East Coast. And in some cases, churches that refused to take down pictures of Jesus alayhi salam, Isa alayhi salam, the community would boycott those churches. The community would put pressure on those churches. And in their cases, where the churches gave into the boycotts. And through dialogue, other churches, through dialogue, the churches themselves agreed to take the picture of Isa, of Jesus, down from inside the church, right? Through dialogue. You had ministers that would convert to Islam because of those discussions. Now, if you have an organization that's telling you you can't deal with churches, that work won't happen. So there were these kinds of things that were out. So there was money coming in from the outside trying to influence Islam in the United States. And the leaders in the African American community would say, hold on for a second. Why is it that you're trying to influence what's going on here, and you have a completely, you're over there. You don't understand what's going on here. We know what we're doing here. And so that caused a friction in the community nationally. It caused a lot of discord. Today, in 2019, we have the exact same thing. It's just in a different package. But we have money right now, today, coming from overseas into American Muslim communities with agendas. And there's no response to it now. There have been meetings, for example, in different Muslim countries with the absence of there's no presence of any American Muslim, nobody from any background. Not one American Muslim is in the room, where the discussion is about how do we influence Islam in America. That's the discussion. I know, because I know people from other countries that have been there. And you have people with money that are doing the same thing. But now, instead of doing this, they are lobbying the FBI. They're lobbying the CIA. They're lobbying the British government to determine which mosques are legitimate and which ones are not, which Muslim schools are legitimate and which ones are not. So these are major lobbying efforts that started in the 90s, and it caused a big division in the Muslim community. The money started to stop in the 9/11 era because the US government started to crack down on international funding coming from overseas. That's how it stopped. Because the war and terror started to crack down on accounts and track different terrorist accounts and stuff like that. So funding from certain countries was dropped. Because funding was dropped, those organizations in America that took that funding, that suddenly didn't have it, they had to change their operations. And they had to change the way they do business. They had to change the way they raise money, which meant they had to invest in a different direction. And they had to build alliances, because in the post-9/11 world, no way you could be Muslim and be anti-American. No way. You had to start interfaith alliances. So all the masajids in different suburban communities started to open up doors to churches. Many of them thought they were pioneers in this. That had been done in African American communities for 30 years. They started to do Islam 101 programs. That had been done for 30 years. They started to do interfaith panels. This became a post-9/11 thing. And because it was new in suburban America thought that this is brand new. Whereas in the urban areas, this was normal. Non-Muslims in the suburban areas, it was their first introduction to Islam, particularly in the white wealthy communities in the South, in the Midwest. So their first introduction to Islam was a post-9/11 era. Why was it their first introduction to Islam? Because the existing institutions there didn't do interfaith. So they didn't reach out. So nobody knew who they were. So in a post-9/11 world, their first introduction to Muslims was 9/11, and after that, their second introduction to Muslim was the local mosque, which became shaped by their introduction via 9/11. So of course, the idea is that Islam is a foreign thing in wealthy suburban America, which has more voting participants than in urban parts of the US. You see where I'm getting with this? Connect the dots. All right. I think we have 10 minutes before Salat or something. 5 minutes before Salat. So we'll take, brother here, Bismillah. Alayhi salam. Thank you, yeah.
I wanted to ask you regarding the social currency that you spoke about earlier with regard to pioneer Muslims who laid a foundation for future Muslims here. I think it would be somewhat disingenuous if we don't attribute some of that social currency to the Nation of Islam and the yeoman work that they put in when no one else was practicing Islam on a grand scale. And so, those things that you spoke about,
Yeah,
cleaning up the neighborhoods,
it started there, yeah.
I'm sorry?
It did have its foundation there, absolutely.
Yes. And so, we have to be careful with that. Secondly, I want to speak to you about, you spoke about intermarriage between the Muslims here in America and why that's vitally important. In my acceptance of speaking 31 years ago, I've yet to hear those words parroted from anyone other than Black Americans. And I think it stems from our inferiority complex that we might have. I've never heard that where, I never heard Pakistani man, the Egyptian man, Albanian man say, it's vitally important that we do some interracial marriages in America. Speak to that, would you please?
I have, yeah, thank you very much. First of all, to your first question, you're absolutely right about that. The notion of cleanup community in this country did begin with the Nation of Islam, so absolutely credit is due in that part for 100%, so that is absolutely correct. Second, it is not a common theme, you're right about that, but I have heard that from different Muslims and from different backgrounds. I have heard that. But interestingly enough, I've heard that from Muslims who make it a part of their engagement to actively engage with all kinds of Muslims from different backgrounds and who they themselves are from families who are comprised of more than one cultural mix-up. So it comes from, in my experience, it tends to come from Muslims who understand the value of that, right? And who have seen what that can do in terms of bridging and uniting cultures. The Prophet ﷺ did that. That was, many of his marriages were to create unions and connections between communities that didn't have a connection. That actually comes originally from the Prophet ﷺ. So I think, but to go back to your specific point, I think part of it may stem from an idea, the sense that there has been a perception that certain people in African American communities, for example, do not fit the bill or the standards, for example. I don't necessarily think that it's totally from an inferiority complex because it's not a widespread desire. It's not like brothers, for example, I meet are like, trying to marry Muslim women from different backgrounds and countries. People generally just want to get married, for example. But I think it comes up as a response to the problem of the fact that we're not together as we should be. And one of the signs of being together is that we're together at multiple levels beyond just standing shoulder to shoulder in the prayer rug, for example. So if it's not marriage, for example, living together in communities, for example. Doing business is another example that comes up together as well. We don't have to do business in segregated communities. If we are really one community, we should be able to do business with each other, for example, and go into partnerships with each other. So I think part of it is a call and a desire for a more close-knit relationship at its very core. I don't think it's related to the fact that African American Muslim, Black American Muslims really aren't, feel they're inferior, and if they marry outside of their racial culture or what have you, that somehow they gain that that sense of worth. But I think it's a commentary about a desire for a more solid and unified sense of belonging and well-being of the community. You know,
I just think it's a microcosm of macrocosm. In Hollywood, 90% of your African American actors have made it by being white. I've done it. And I just think it's a and you know, we can disagree on that, but I think it's a microcosm of macrocosm.
Sure, sure. So thank you very much. I think they're asking me to cut it now. Those that would like to continue, inshallah, but we need to go to salat now, inshallah ta'ala. And so, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.